Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Sumrick, Executive Director of Humanities Nebraska, and I am here to welcome you and kind of say a few things as we kick off a second program around our virtual Chautauqua, exploring the 1950s. And I'm really glad to have the technology to be able to do this together this way. Normally, Humanities Nebraska is all about bringing people together in person to explore different issues. Our mission is to explore what connects us and makes us human, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. We've been doing that for 47 years, and this is one of the ways in Chautauqua we've been doing for at least the last 35 years. But this is the first time that it's online. And so hopefully next year, we plan to be back together in person. Kearney, Nebraska hosted Chautauqua last year on this theme of the 1950s, and Ashland was scheduled for this year, but we're gonna enthusiastically go back to Ashland in 2021. But in the meantime, there's so many things that were great to talk about right now that are really important as we look at a really important element of our time in our history and connect it to where we are now and where we're trying to go in the future. So this format is also like our Humanities at Home programming we've been doing since the spring. Once a lot of our in-person programs were getting canceled due to COVID-19. And so we're convening different programs virtually this way, where we can get you in front of different speakers. And the way that you can get involved in this yourself too is to ask questions on Facebook as we go through this conversation today. I hope you have some great questions for our speaker, Jim Newton, who I'll introduce in a moment, and tell us where you're from. It's Humanities at Home, so you might throw in there where you're from while you're at that. So Humanities Nebraska is a nonprofit. We're funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. We have some state funding and then private donors all across Nebraska who support us. We're very grateful to everybody who supports Humanities Nebraska, especially with so many needs out there. So thank you so much for that to those of you who donate to Humanities Nebraska. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Jim Newton to you, and we'll kick this off tonight to talk about President Eisenhower, the Eisenhower presidency, and all the things that were happening in the 1950s. So Jim Newton is a veteran journalist. He's an author and a teacher. He spent 25 years at the Los Angeles Times, working as a reporter, editor, bureau chief, columnist, and then from 2000 to 2010, he was the editor of the editorial pages. He's a recipient of many awards, locally and nationally, in journalism, and he participated in 2 different staff efforts at the Los Angeles Times, coverage of the 1992 Los Angeles riots and the 1994 Northridge earthquake that received the Pulitzer Prize. Before coming to the Times, he was a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He began his career as a clerk to the New York Times columnist James Reston, and he's a graduate of Dartmouth College. Jim moved to UCLA in 2015 to teach communication studies and public policy, and to also found Blueprint, which is a new UCLA magazine addressing policy challenges facing California and Los Angeles area in particular. And he serves as editor-in-chief there. He's a respected author of 4 important works of history, including Justice for All, Earl Warren and the Nation He Made, Eisenhower, The White House Years, which we're going to talk more about today, The Worthy Fights, a memoir of leadership and peace, which came out in 2014 in collaboration with former CIA Director and Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. And then just recently in May, his 4th book was published, A Man of Tomorrow, The Relentless Life of Jerry Brown. So it's a history of California since 1960, as well as a biography of its longest serving governor. If any of you were attending last night or yesterday, we had a great program looking primarily at civil rights in the 1950s, and with scholars of Rosa Parks and Thurgood Marshall, and UNL professor Patrick Jones gave a great overview of the 1950s, kind of leading into that. If you weren't there watching live, you can find that on our Facebook page as well. And as Patrick talked about, there are a lot of things happening in the 1950s, domestically, internationally, across culture, economics, politics, military, many, many different areas. So there's a lot of meat to sink into. And tonight, Jim's going to help us kind of look at it through the lens of the Eisenhower administration. And so to kind of get us started in talking about the 1950s, and the many different issues that were facing President Eisenhower during his years in the White House. Jim, would you take a few minutes to kind of just frame this discussion? And would you describe maybe some of the bigger fundamental takeaways from the time you spent researching and writing Eisenhower, the White House years?
Well, yes, I will. Thank you, Chris, very much. I appreciate it. And it's really a pleasure to be with all of you, if only electronically. I do. First of all, for those of you who have seen it already, the program yesterday, you already know, was terrific. For those of you who haven't, I really highly recommend it. And Professor Jones, who did the introduction and moderated the conversation yesterday, did, as Chris just mentioned, a really thoughtful synopsis of the 50s. So in order to not completely repeat that, for those of you who've seen it, I'll skip through that a little more quickly than I might otherwise. But perhaps repeating a little of what he said. There's two basic premises, I think, that undergird my book about Eisenhower, the White House years, which first, that the 50s are a much more consequential and important period than many people, I think, give them credit for. And second, that Eisenhower was a much more deft, nimble and complex leader in that period than certainly the contemporaries regarded him as. Over time, more and more historians, I think, have come around to the idea that he was more effective in more ways than people appreciated at the time. But so just briefly to sort of sketch that out, I think the 50s, starting with the 50s, to some degree, they get lost a little bit between the war in the 40s, obviously, and the tumult of the 60s. And as a result, they're kind of in kind of popular culture regarded as this sort of interregnum period between these two great crisis periods. And to some degree, that's not totally inaccurate. It is a period of a relatively healthy and growing economy in the United States, for instance, a healthy middle class. So there are things that are accurate in that portrayal. But what that portrayal really misses is the huge number of undercurrents and difficulties that also were present in that period. Again, some of these Professor Jones went through nimbly yesterday, but I'll just talk about a couple quickly. First of all, issues of labor, civil rights, early feminism, all very present in that period. Class issues, gender, generational tensions, the generation that comes of age in the 1960s and becomes the bulwark of the protest movement of that period, the anti-war movement in particular. Many of them come out of the 1950s and are formed by a sense of repression or difficulty of expressing themselves in the 1950s. So some of what is germinating in the 1950s comes to fruition in the 60s. In a couple areas, though, I think we sort of misremember the history. Civil rights, for instance, very much associated with the 1960s, but many of the signature moments in the civil rights movement really occur in the 50s. One that we'll talk about more, I'm sure, today is Brown versus Board of Education. By some reckonings, the most important ruling in the history of the United States Supreme Court, certainly the most important modern ruling of the court. That's 1954. Right at the beginning of Earl Warren's tenure on the court. The Montgomery bus boycott, 55, the Little Rock crisis when Eisenhower dispatched troops to enforce desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957. Much of the great work of Thurgood Marshall as a lawyer, as distinct from his work as a justice in the 1950s, including Brown versus Board, and much of Martin Luther King's rise to prominence and important work takes place in the 1950s. The 1960s are more notable for their legislative achievements in civil rights, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Freedom Riders, who actually I learned in the program yesterday had some early glimmerings in the 1950s. But the Freedom Riders and John Lewis, of course, just died very recently. Most of that activism took place in the 50s or in the 60s, but most of that was, in fact, in Lewis's case, quite personally, was very much came to him in the 1950s, and then he expressed it later as an activist himself in the 60s. So that's all a part of this domestic piece of American history at that point. It is also embedded within this larger international history of the period. And I've just jotted to myself a list of conflicts that involved the United States in the 1950s. The Korean War, of course, when Eisenhower became president, the Korean War was still underway. He brought it to a conclusion or to an armistice anyway, about 6 months later. In the years after that, in the Eisenhower presidency, there were military and political conflicts that engaged the United States in one way or another. In Iran, Guatemala, Berlin, Indonesia, Lebanon, Hungary, Vietnam, the Congo, and Cuba. That's a lot of conflict. Now, I should also note the number of American military casualties, battle casualties in that period is one. One soldier was killed by a sniper in Lebanon. That's an extraordinary record of peacekeeping through a period that is much more turbulent and much more violent, I think, than many people remember. And that is very much where I can sort of segue to Eisenhower. Eisenhower, I believe, and I certainly try to express in the book, was a much more skillful and much more involved leader, particularly in the foreign affairs areas in that period, than the coverage of him, the media coverage, or even the historical coverage of him in the immediate aftermath of the administration would lead you to believe. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we can talk about more of them as we go here. One is a style of leadership. He believed very much in leading through subordinates. He believed that it was part of his responsibility to ratchet down the sense of crisis in the country. That he was a believer, he was not a libertarian. He did not believe that government was evil or needed to be eliminated, but he did believe that Americans shouldn't wake up having to be concerned about the state of their government, that they didn't need to be preoccupied with it. And he objected to what he believed in the Roosevelt and Truman years was an intensity that he felt was inappropriate. And he wanted deliberately to ratchet it down. Somewhat in contrast, I would say, to today's presidency. We can talk about that if you want later too. But he wanted deliberately to bring the temperature down. And that had the effect of sometimes making him seem inactive or not present in decision making, when in fact very important decisions were being made behind the scenes. This is what became known by one of the first scholars, I think, to recognize the complexity and the depth of the Eisenhower years, Fred Greenstein, who labeled it, as you may have heard, the hidden hand presidency. It's Eisenhower leading through others and his own involvement being somewhat obscure to the public. I'll just close on this and then turn it back to you. When I was sitting down to write the book, after having done research for several years on it, I was looking for an episode that would try to capture some of that, some of the import of the 50s and some of Eisenhower's style of governing in a way that might not have been obvious at the time, but now as we look back on it, demonstrates something about his skill. And the episode that I settled upon is the prologue of the book. It takes place on May 1st of 1958, May Day. Fairly quiet day in the world. In fact, I just pulled up some newspapers from Nebraska to see what was being reported in Nebraska that day. The Lincoln Star reported a story about Eisenhower as its lead. The headline is "Safety Solvency Stressed by Ike." There's a story about agricultural prices. The Battle Creek Enterprise led with the calf sale upcoming on that Saturday. This is not the portrayal of a world in crisis. It's a sense of a very calm day in the world. Except that what was happening in the White House that day is a meeting of the National Security Council to debate the future of nuclear weapons policy by the United States. And the particular issue that was being discussed that day was the desire on the part of some of Eisenhower's subordinates to change American nuclear strategy. Up to that point, it had been predicated on the idea that any Soviet incursion into Europe would generate a full-scale American response, a nuclear annihilation of the Soviet Union. Some of Eisenhower's advisors, including Dulles, believed that that threat was not credible, that the Soviets would not believe that the United States would risk the future of the world if the Soviets took over, if they encroached on, say, West Germany. And so some of Ike's advisors forcefully advised him to develop a nuclear response strategy by which smaller nuclear weapons could be used more routinely to fend off invasion or to retaliate. Ike said no. None of this was reported in the newspapers. Ike believed that the only way to prevent a nuclear war was to threaten an all-out nuclear war. Now, we can argue about the merits of that and whether that was the right strategy. But what we know for sure, or what we can, I think, logically infer, is had he taken the other course, the logical conclusion of that is that nuclear wars would have been fought much more routinely. Smaller ones, but it's quite possible those crises that I just listed for you in resolving a standoff in Formosa or Taiwan or Berlin or Indonesia or the Congo, that the United States might have used a nuclear weapon. It is quite possible that we would not be here today to talk about that if that were the case. So that is a decision of enormous existential import. And what was reported in the next day's paper is that that he was stressing safety and solvency. The papers also reported that he took an hour off to practice his putting on the back lawn of the White House. All of that's true, but it disguises the real import of what was going on. And so that's the premise of my book, and that's what I would hope I've conveyed in the prologue and in the rest of the book, and it's kind of the underlying notion.
You know, that I'm glad you mentioned that prologue, because when I was reading all this, I was kind of trying to put myself in the heads of people living in the 50s and nuclear weapons being so new. So first of all, World War II was just a few years before, and the world, the country and the world were still getting used to this idea of nuclear weapons. And, you know, you have this heroic general coming into office as president now, as the Korean War is waging, and you write a little bit about this at some point about, you know, the stalemate of the Korean War. You know, the Chinese have come in. You know, things have been, you know, just pretty brutal, and then there starts to be this conversation about, well, why don't we use nukes there? And I think this maybe was before the tactical nuke discussion had taken place. But, you know, and at one point you mentioned Eisenhower even kind of threatening Mao of China, hey, we may do this or something. How serious was he about the idea of using nukes in China?
Eisenhower dreaded nothing more than the idea of a full-scale war in his presidency. He really, as I said or alluded or suggested earlier, he believed in ratcheting tensions down, not up. He inherited the Korean War and was elected largely because Americans believed he was the person most capable of bringing it to a successful conclusion. He did, through Indian intermediaries, warn China that he was prepared to use a nuclear weapon. Whether he was ever actually serious about that is hard to tell. One of his, a person well known to him, under whom he had worked as a young officer in the military, Douglas MacArthur, suggested the use of nuclear weapons to bring the Korean War to an end. In fact, his proposal, which is hard to even imagine today, was to bomb every Chinese airfield within flying distance of South Korea with the nuclear weapon, and then to sow radioactive waste along the Yalu River to prevent reinvasion of South Korea for 10,000 years. Now that's a different world. If Eisenhower follows that advice, I'm pretty sure that we're not talking about it in the same way today. And I must say, one of the things that I think really distinguishes the Eisenhower presidency is his willingness to say no to advice like that. It's a difficult thing for a civilian leader to say no over and over to a military command that is arguing that its recommendations are essential to the defense of the national security. Eisenhower was not intimidated by the military leadership. He'd been the military leadership. Gone to school with some of them, he knew them, he'd been their boss, and he had been subordinate to some of them, including MacArthur. So I do think he was, if not uniquely, at least unusually well positioned to hear that advice, understand it for what it was, and not take it. And I think we're lucky that he did.
One of the most striking, the photographs you have in the book throughout the Eisenhower administration and prior to that, one that really struck out is when he was informed that Truman had fired MacArthur, and the look on his face. Exactly. So, yeah, that must have been remarkable to have to deal with. I actually want to read you talking about Eisenhower's take on war, and just as I want to read a quote that really jumped out at me, where you compare him to George Washington of a little bit, and it's just brief here, but I thought, and just maybe have you comment a little bit on it. But you said, all presidents save Washington are measured against their predecessors. As he ascended to the presidency that January morning, Eisenhower naturally was compared to Truman, just as Truman had been so unfavorably and unfairly found wanting in the shadow of FDR. In fact, the president whose background and service most resembled those that Ike brought to the office was Washington himself. Both were military heroes of their country, and both commanded respect and regard that crossed party, regional, sectarian divisions. They were presidents, of course, but more than that, they were cohesive forces for America. Washington at its outset, Ike as it entered a troubling phase of its history, a period of grave and vague danger, of war without war, of threat and bluff. And you just spoke to a lot of that, but is that where the comparison ends with Washington, really, is sort of that on that military side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it ends there, but I do think it's worth considering them as a pair, obviously separated by a lot of time. But as noted there, they come to the presidency with military backgrounds, and they serve as unifying figures politically, culturally, and otherwise. And of course, skipping sort of to the end of the story here, when Eisenhower was preparing to leave office and he delivered his famous farewell address, he was very influenced by Washington's decision to not deliver in the way that Eisenhower delivered it, because he didn't deliver it orally, but he delivered a written farewell to the country, and used it to try to argue against party and division and sectarianism. Eisenhower used his to a different purpose, which was to raise alarms about the military-industrial complex, but also to call for unity and to leave a legacy of cohesion. And I think that was important to both of them, not maybe more common temperament than part of their common military background, but all of that wrapped up, I think, in at least in Eisenhower's case, an appreciation for what Washington had done and a desire to do some of the same.
Thank you. When you and I were talking previously, I'm going to jump more kind of back to the civil rights side of things a little bit, but also through Earl Warren. So, because again, there's so many things that weave together here. You had commented to me that when you had written the book on Earl Warren first. Right. And then, so you had this idea of what you would be writing about with Eisenhower, and maybe that evolved a little bit as you did the research. So, in reading about, Ike's, President Eisenhower's relationship with Earl Warren, and, when they were primary foes first, and, Earl Warren, the governor of California, then appointed Supreme Court justice later. When he chose Warren, he chose Warren, and there was a sort of, it seemed like a good relationship, but then there was kind of evolving friction maybe. And then, as you said, Brown versus Board of Education comes into play, and which we talked about quite a bit with on the Thurgood Marshall front yesterday. Could you just kind of talk a little bit about this, about Earl Warren's place with Eisenhower, and sort of leading into Eisenhower's kind of take on the civil rights as that played out, and really to me, what seemed like just had to be a real difficult thing to deal with, but the Little Rock situation and calling in the troops.
Right. Yes. Well, there's a lot there, and I've written 2 whole books about it, so I could talk for a long time about it. The Warren-Eisenhower relationship is something I have now seen very much from both sides. As you mentioned, I started with Warren, and when I was really persuaded to do the Eisenhower book by a great editor in New York, I thought I was setting out to write a book that would be highly critical of Eisenhower. And I did so mainly because I had seen him mostly through Warren's eyes and through the prism of civil rights, which are not the most flattering perspectives to take on Eisenhower. And yet that's not the book I ended up writing. I ended up being much more impressed by Eisenhower as I got to know him better through his own papers and through the perspectives outside of civil rights, particularly foreign affairs and the Cold War. But that said, I think Eisenhower and Warren, in some respects, seemed very alike at the moment where Eisenhower put Warren on the court. They both were sort of moderate to liberal Republicans. Warren grew out of the progressive era tradition in California. Eisenhower, of course, a very different background, a military background, but also seen as not part of that isolationist, domestically conservative part of the Republican Party. Robert Taft really was an opponent of both of them. They both saw their opponents within the Republican Party as conservatives within the party. They saw themselves as part of the moderate to liberal part of the party. So in that sense, they were similar. In other respects, they ended up being very different. And I think their similarities made them think they were more alike than they turned out to be. Warren, of course, had a life in politics. Eisenhower did not. Warren was much more, I think, nimble in domestic affairs and in civil rights than Eisenhower, for whom those were much more newer topics for him as president than they were for Warren. Warren had dealt with them as governor, not always successfully, by the way. So Eisenhower saw Warren as an ally and as a friend and as someone who shared some of his politics. When I say friend, acquaintance, but someone with whom he was friendly. He promised him the first vacancy on the court, not expecting that the chief justiceship would be the first vacancy. But then he hedged a little bit and didn't immediately offer it to Warren when the vacancy occurred. In fact, he offered it to Dulles first, who turned it down. But then he did proffer it, and Warren held him to it. And Warren, of course, was confirmed and became Chief Justice. As Chief Justice, I was actually thinking about this. Let me stop for one second. I was thinking about this in the context of your panel yesterday. And I very much enjoyed one of the things that your panelists talked about yesterday was whether policy leads opinion or whether opinion leads policy, which is an interesting, not totally answerable question. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. But I would say that Warren believed that the law needed to lead on civil rights. That there was a question before the court, which is, is school segregation constitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution? For Warren, that answer was simple, and the answer was no. That separate but equal was not constitutional in the context of schools. And once a constitutional right is recognized, there is no option other than to deliver on it. Eisenhower believed that people's hearts had to lead policy and believed that pushing people too hard on civil rights would cause them to resist rather than adopt it more naturally. Both of them kind of turned out to be right in the sense that I think Warren was absolutely right to recognize that this was a constitutional right that was being violated. If anything, the court may have moved too slowly in insisting on enforcement of that right. It allowed states to proceed with, as it infamously said, all deliberate speed, which, as one scholar of the court has said, meant a lot of deliberation and not very much speed. And there was wholesale resistance. The state of Virginia shut down its school system rather than integrate it. So Eisenhower was right that Brown versus Board invited resistance, and Warren was right that the court had to do what it did. And I think that fundamental both of them felt vindicated by what happened, and both of them resented the other for having taken the opposite course. I don't think that it proves that either of them was wrong, but it does help explain why they very much drifted apart in their later years. And so one of the ironies of this is that Eisenhower ends up being responsible for desegregation, first of schools and then many American institutions, by appointing Warren, with whom he had later lost some confidence. So it's a bit inadvertent on Eisenhower's part. He does make the moves that cause the right things to happen, even though he's sort of resentful at times that they're happening as quickly as they are.
Yeah, great. And meanwhile, a whole nother domestic issue connected to a global issue in the Cold War is you have McCarthyism going on. And so, obviously that started before Eisenhower became president, but you've got Joe McCarthy's campaign to root out communists, going on as President Eisenhower comes into office. It had been kind of an issue during the campaign that he had to address a little bit here and there. For people who really who weren't there and don't know what it was like as this sort of fear of communism was going on in our country, and rooting out any kind of communist sympathizers, could you kind of paint a picture of what was happening there and then how Eisenhower addressed it as president?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say Eisenhower took a backseat to no one in terms of his anti-communism. He believed communism was a threat to Western civilization and was committed to thwarting the expansion of the Soviet Union and, by extension, the expansion of communism as an idea. Where this gets more complicated is particularly domestically in the question of the Communist Party was never outlawed in this country. We have rights of speech and association, and there were many academics, people in Hollywood, everyday working people, who found some sympathy with, if not the Communist Party itself, at least with ideas like increased wages or health benefits or retirement benefits or other things that opponents of them tended to label as communistic. And so what ensued was a very nuanced and sometimes very hostile conversation about the limits of American speech and association. McCarthy, more than any other person, certainly more notably than any other person, exploited those divisions and falsely claimed to have lists of communists in the State Department or elsewhere. And sometimes it was 200 odd people, and sometimes it was 160. And when he was asked to show the lists, he could never produce them. There's a lot of fabrication that went on with McCarthy. And Eisenhower was repulsed by McCarthy personally and politically. Among other things, McCarthy took aim at George Marshall, who was Eisenhower's mentor and the person who put him in charge of the invasion of Europe. And it was shameless, false, and despicable of McCarthy to label him as a communist or as a communist sympathizer or someone responsible for China going communist. Eisenhower occasionally seemed to publicly be ready to resist McCarthy, but more often he remained silent, and on the belief that Congress had to resolve the McCarthy question, that he wouldn't dignify McCarthy by affording him a debate with the President of the United States. My friend, Dave Nichols, who's written a whole book about this and done really excellent work exploring the behind the scenes, the hidden hand presidency of Eisenhower when it comes to McCarthy. And I touch on some of this in my book too. I think what both of us discovered, Dave in even greater detail, much more granular detail than I did, is the extent to which Eisenhower was actively working to undermine McCarthy, even while he was denying him the opportunity to debate him publicly. So he was meeting with newspaper publishers and opinion leaders and members of Congress and others, urging them to try to cut off McCarthy where they could. And of course, ultimately, McCarthy's fall is precipitated by the fact that he went after the Army. And when he tackled the Army on television with Eisenhower's encouragement, it exposed him for the vicious fighter that he was and the unprincipled fighter that he was. And so within a year or so, I think it's by the end of 1954, McCarthy's done. Now, Eisenhower was much criticized at the time for not taking him on more publicly and aggressively. One thing that's interesting about that, by the way, just as a little aside, the assumption was always that if Eisenhower spoke up publicly, he would speak out against McCarthy. And it's worth asking the question, how did everyone know that he would speak out against him? And the answer, although it wasn't written about at the time, is that he was meeting privately with people and making it clear how opposed he was to him. So he was making his antagonism toward McCarthy known. He just wasn't doing so publicly. Now, that's a strategic decision. And would a public confrontation with McCarthy have brought McCarthyism to an earlier end? Perhaps. Or perhaps, as Eisenhower feared, it would have elevated McCarthy, made him even more of a national figure than he was, even perhaps made him a political threat to Eisenhower. So that's a calculation. Whether he made the right one or not is hard to judge. What we can say for sure, again, is that by the end of 54, McCarthyism was, as Eisenhower liked to say, McCarthyism. And it was over as a phenomenon in American life. It did a lot of damage in the meantime. And maybe Eisenhower could have done more to keep it from doing some of that damage, but there was risk in that path too.
Interesting. And in the small world category, Christy commented that Dave Nichols was a presenter at our Chautauqua last year in Kearney.
Right?
So maybe your paths will cross next year in Ashland. We'll see.
We spent a lot of time together in Abilene, so
okay.
Delighted. He's a good guy.
So, but then, okay, so, McCarthyism, talking about this domestic turmoil, really, with that going on and political here, but then you have Joseph Stalin die, and the Soviet leadership, a big mystery, what's happening there, and of course the Cold War keeps accelerating in the nuclear weapons race. So, how did Eisenhower navigate that going on in our foes of the Soviet Union?
And that's very early in Eisenhower's tenure that Stalin died, and he was shocked to discover that there wasn't really an American plan in place for how to react to what obviously was eventually going to be the death of Stalin. I think Eisenhower saw it as a great opportunity to change the course of the relationship. It didn't change it as fundamentally as he would have liked. He proposed what was called the Atoms for Peace plan, an opportunity to really rethink the role of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, and try to use that as part of a recalibration point of the relationship with the Soviets. There was a period where it was unclear who the next Soviet leader would be. So on practical terms, there was a period of the US government trying to figure out. Ultimately, of course, it's Khrushchev who emerges, but that was not obvious necessarily that Khrushchev would be the heir to Stalin. So there was also a sort of personal period of trying to figure out who Eisenhower's counterpart would be. One way of thinking about Eisenhower in terms of his relations with the Soviet Union is that really it's a three-part conversation in a sense, although that's a slight misnomer. But the United States uses nuclear weapons and the threat of covert action and the fact of covert action to try to hold the Soviet Union in check or even roll it back, Soviet influence to roll it back, sometimes wisely, sometimes unwisely. So one aspect is the Soviets are the foe, nuclear weapons and other military threats are the tool. At the same time, he's trying to engage the Soviet Union in a conversation about limiting nuclear weapons. In that case, the weapons themselves really are the foe, and the Soviets are an intended ally in a conversation to bring that threat down. He's somewhat successful and somewhat unsuccessful in both of those strange conversations. There are successful summits and opportunities, and an unsuccessful summit at the very end of his presidency, all around these intentions of trying to hold the Soviet Union in check. Nuclear weapons proliferated throughout his administration, so he never succeeded in curbing the spread of nuclear weapons, but of course he did succeed in preventing the use of nuclear weapons, and that ultimately that was his highest objective, and so at least in that sense he was successful in that piece of it.
Thanks. And I'm monopolizing questions right now. I know that we have people on Facebook, quite a few people watching on Facebook, and until they ask questions, I'm going to keep going with what I have. So if you have questions that are watching this, please type them in the comments, and because I tend to nerd out on the politics and the geopolitics side of things, and so I'm going to do that one more time here, and that is, thinking about you rattled off all those different conflicts that were happening around the world, and it's remarkable to think there was only one American casualty during that. But as I was thinking about how many of those sort of conflicts still are with us today. Obviously, Korea is still something that is in our sphere of worries, but another one is Iran. And it's interesting, over the years, Iran kind of comes up and down as a crisis sort of situation. But going back to Eisenhower's administration, you write about, in 1953, so again, early on, the overthrow, and I apologize, I never know the right pronunciation of Mossadegh. Is
as good as any, yeah. Most
okay, right. Okay, but that brought bringing the Shah to power, and then the revolution in 1979 brought the Ayatollah to power, and then you have the whole everything since then, and sort of, I guess I'm just wondering if you could give a little context about that with Iran, and just the unintended consequences sometimes of things you set in motion.
Yeah, I think the two foreign policy adventures, both early in the Eisenhower tenure, that continue to ripple into our present day life with profound unintended and some significantly negative consequences, are Iran and Guatemala. In both cases, the United States used covert operations to undermine the attempts at democratic processes of those countries. And in both instances, the fear was that the Soviets would gain a foothold in those countries if the United States did not intervene in some way. For Eisenhower, covert action was an appealing third option to doing nothing or military engagement. He, as for all the reasons we've already talked about, was loath to use American military force. He understood probably better than any person on earth the implications of that kind of a facial confrontation with the Soviets or anyone else using military force, and was extremely reluctant to do so, and I would argue appropriately reluctant to do so, particularly as the Soviets acquired and developed their own nuclear weapons capacity. But he was also unwilling to simply allow what he saw as Soviet influence in countries in different parts of the world. And Iran was the first of them to come under this kind of microscope, and Guatemala was cropped up in the following year. The United States, although it was covert in the sense that there was never a full disclosure of the American people about what the United States was doing in Iran, it was obvious to people in Iran that the United States government was intervening to try to steer the power away from Mossadegh. That has had profound and lasting influence in the sense of creating suspicion of the American government, American people, and America's willingness to allow Iran, a proud country with a long, much more ancient history than the United States, to chart its own destiny. Similarly, in Latin America, the specter of American meddling in democratic process is alive today. And not all of it comes out of the Arbenz intervention in 1954, but some of it dates to that. It's difficult to imagine that anyone in 1953 or 1954 would have imagined, certainly in the case of Iran, the Ayatollah coming to power a generation later. But that anti-Americanism was that the Ayatollah and others took advantage of in that revolution, is there in part because Eisenhower planted the seeds of it. And that's, what are the cost benefits of that? To be completely sort of Machiavellian about it, let's assume that it's correct that Eisenhower prevented the Soviets from gaining a foothold in Iran in 1953 by the actions that he and the CIA took then. That's a benefit to the United States. Iranian oil, Iranian access to the Persian Gulf, those did not fall into hostile hands during a period where it would have been dangerous for them to. If that's the benefit, then the cost is a long-term distrust of the United States that future presidents and future Americans had to pay the price for. Hard to know how that tallies up on the balance sheet, but it would be naive to say that there wasn't a cost paid for it, whatever that benefit was. The cost just happened to get paid much later.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pull in Christy Hyatt-Carley on this, our Humanities Nebraska's program manager for Chautauqua, and she has a couple of questions that we have from people that are watching online. So Christy, what do you have?
So the first one that we have is from Kate Benzel, and she asks about history intersecting the arts of the times, and talks about much of the 1950s literature brings forward those undercurrents that you've been talking about, Lolita, Fahrenheit 451, Invisible Man, so on and so forth. Would you say that Eisenhower, did he pay attention to those kinds of works, or how did the government deal with those works criticizing the political world?
Yeah, interesting. I don't think of Eisenhower as a terribly literary figure. He liked Westerns. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine him reading Lolita or Howl or some of the great, counterculture works of the period. Eisenhower and beatniks don't kind of fit in the same sentence. So I'm not aware of him personally responding to any of the works that you just mentioned. But that this idea that the United States in this period was developing into a culture that valued kind of material well-being and personal privacy and security, suburban America. In fact, the panel yesterday talked some about this, the idea of the suburbs, principally the white suburbs, as being a kind of ideal of American life. That propelled an uneasiness. Some of it with students, some of it with artists, and artists of all types, poets from Ginsberg, novelists, some of whom you just cited. So there is a loud, beginning in the 50s and then later louder in the 1960s, cultural reaction to what some saw as a stifling view of American culture. Eisenhower did not see it as stifling. And so that's why it's hard for me to imagine him sitting down with his copy of Howl and working through a cup of coffee and trying to make sense of it. He saw that as a triumph of a certain kind of culture, that security is exactly what he longed for. And I don't think he felt stifled by it in any sense at all. So I would say that culture that you just described is a reaction in some ways to his values, and an understandable one, but one that probably didn't affect him personally or deeply.
Thanks. And I know Christy's got a couple other questions queuing up, but first I wanted to interject something else we shouldn't neglect being in Nebraska, and that is, we are a gorgeous state with a lot of different topography and everything, but most people you talk to, their experience with Nebraska is driving along Interstate 80, and I think it's kind of what people take for granted that the interstate system's always been there. But can you share a little bit about President Eisenhower's place with the interstate highway system?
Yeah, well, he is the father of it, and yes, to the extent that that's helped bring Nebraska to people's attention, then you have him to thank for it. Two sources of inspiration for Eisenhower, who brought about the highway system. One, while in Germany as a conquering general, had the opportunity to see the Autobahn and the German infrastructure for highways and was impressed. And the other was Earl Warren and Earl Warren's construction of the highway system in California. Again, as we talked about earlier, I think Eisenhower and Warren had certain things in common, and one was a belief that government should provide for infrastructure, that was an appropriate role for government. Both of them Republicans, and yet neither of them shy about seeing that as a function of government. One of your panelists yesterday said that the initial impulse for the highway system was national security. I would agree with that in part. That was certainly part of the public sales of the idea that the United States needed the ability to move troops and munitions internally. I'm not sure that Eisenhower ever actually believed that. I think that was part of the political sales for it. He really did see it as an opportunity to open up the country to commerce and travel and tourism and just mobility. And it clearly had that effect. And it was a big part of the American economic expansion of that period was just the ability to move around what is a vast country, obviously. And Eisenhower, of course, had also supported the St. Lawrence Seaway for some of the same ideas. He believed the government should fund infrastructure and that infrastructure in turn could propel commerce and that commerce was good for the country. And so he believed in it and followed through.
All right. Well, thank you, President Eisenhower. But I'll encourage anybody not from Nebraska coming through, get off the interstate and check out other parts of the state. Okay. And then Christy, I think you have another question from somebody that's watching.
Yeah. So we have a question here from Mary, and she was asking what you would consider to be Eisenhower's greatest contribution as president, and what you would consider to be his greatest failure.
I think his greatest contribution was keeping the peace without resort to nuclear weapons. I think Eisenhower is the first American president to have a nuclear weapon and not use it. And his refusal to use it when many around him wanted him to use it, and when it would have been terribly easy to do so. It would have been more natural than not to use a nuclear weapon, atomic weapon as they were then called, to end the Korean War. And yet that would have ushered us into a period in which the use of nuclear weapons was plausible instead of being all but unthinkable. And that would have posed dangers to humanity, the likes of which we rarely, if ever, confronted. And he, maybe not alone, but he principally is responsible for making that all but unthinkable. And I think the world really owes him gratitude for that. I think his worst failures or failure is probably in the area of civil rights. But again, it's more paradoxical and complicated because a lot of important civil rights work happened in the Eisenhower years, and some of its greatest successes are the results of people he put in power, most notably Earl Warren. But also his other justices, by the way. He appointed 5 justices to the United States Supreme Court. All 5 of them joined in the civil rights decisions. Not all of them were there for Brown. Only Warren was there for Brown. But the decisions that followed after Brown that relied on Brown, his other justices were party to too. And so and of course there's the Little Rock, and Little Rock, when push came to shove and defiance really reached an apotheosis, Eisenhower refused to yield and made it clear that the full force of the United States government would stand behind the court and behind its desegregation orders. So he ended up doing many of the things that he was called upon to do in civil rights. I don't think he ever invested his moral leadership behind the issue. He never led rhetorically on it. He would say, for instance, the Supreme Court has ordered and I will obey. Well, obedience is not really, I think, what was called for in that period. Leadership would have been more helpful. And he had such stature with the American people that had he lent a more enthusiastic support for the issue of civil rights, we might have had an easier run of it in the 50s and beyond. So I guess I would call that his greatest failure, with the asterisk that he also presided over some important achievements in that area too.
Thanks, Jim. And I know we're getting closer to the end here. So, we could, if anybody else has a question from the audience, please comment on it. But as we kind of get into our last few minutes here, thinking about the criticisms and accolades both of Eisenhower, at some point I was reading in your book about criticism from journalists, and I don't know if it was during his second term more, but it kind of got me to thinking about the media's role in politics and in criticism of a president. And there's so much talk right now about media bias and fake news and things like that. And we've done other programming about the journalism's role in democracy and politics. And I'm just kind of curious, for people who are kind of interested in that area, what was different then about the way journalism addressed politics and the work of the presidency compared to now?
Well, a lot was different, and not all better or worse. I mean, I think there are things that are media is in some ways much more responsible today, and in some ways much more reckless. I mean, I think it's important to say at the outset that I think that reporters of his day did not really get Eisenhower correctly. I don't think the coverage of the day does justice to the work of the Eisenhower personally or the administration. Some of that, though, is Eisenhower's own doing. Eisenhower's desire not to be the center of attention and his belief that he would be more effective if he were not always at the middle of every story. So to some degree, he brought on his own, the misunderstandings about him. He cultivated them. I mean, I think, and this is there's a whole longer, different conversation to have here about media. Media of the era, I happen to teach a class of journalistic ethics at UCLA, so I've been through this with students many times over the years. Media of the era was much more deferential. FDR had a long affair as president, unreported, who's, as many people know, was not even generally known or generally reported that FDR couldn't walk without braces and was often confined to a wheelchair. That's deference that was given to the president, the sense that presidents had privacy and that there was a private life that was distinct from their public duties. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that's hard to answer. I mean, I think the American public, when it elected FDR to a fourth term, did not realize they were electing a man who was significantly ill and who was unlikely to live out that term. That's a bit of an injustice. I mean, I think that's a failure of media to alert the American people to the consequences of that election. It made FDR's choice for vice president, for instance, much more meaningful than it would have otherwise been. And the press knew that there were problems, there were issues there, and didn't report them. And I think that's an example of deference going too far. On the other hand, I think it's safe to say that there are many people who are offended by the aggressiveness and what they sometimes see as intrusiveness of modern press. And is there a way to have both? Well, that's hard to know. There is a bit of a pendulum at work. There was a period in early American history where the press was much more partisan and aggressive. And then there was a period in the Eisenhower years where the goal of media was to be objective and to not sway so much, to not be so conspicuous in its allegiances politically. We may be in an era today that's more like the early America than that period in the Eisenhower years. There are things to commend a partisan press, and then there are things that are lost by people believing that the press is affiliated with one ideology or one party or the other. And so I don't know that there's a way to say which is better, but we have lived through both, and I think each of them produces their own negative consequences.
Thank you. That's fascinating to think about. I'm going to wrap two audience questions together as we kind of move into wrapping up. And one is back to the worst decisions or thing he made, and the question from Edgar Hicks is what did Eisenhower view as his worst mistake, and was it appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court specifically? He's asking. And then just also as you answer that, thinking about a kind of a final question from the audience was about what lessons we can take away from the Eisenhower administration that would help us today.
Well, the first one's, neither one's easy, but maybe the first one's a little briefer. There's a famous, but possibly apocryphal quote of Eisenhower's that, and by the way, there's different variants of this. One is that the worst mistake I made as president was appointing that son of a bitch, Earl Warren, to the Supreme Court. Another is I only made two mistakes as president, and both of them are sitting on the Supreme Court, presumably in reference to Warren and William Brennan. The fact that it comes up in different iterations makes me a little suspicious of it. It's a little neat, and I must say it doesn't really sound like Eisenhower to me. So I don't doubt that Eisenhower had regrets about appointing Earl Warren, but I'm a little skeptical of the quotes in which he says so quite so brazenly, as he's sometimes reputed to have said. That said, back to the question, I think he regarded Warren, in his more churlish moments, he regarded his appointment of Warren as a mistake. I think he's wrong to do that because Warren is responsible for a huge amount of progress in those years. And Eisenhower would be wiser to take credit for them than to be offended by them. He was, by the way, just a quick aside, he was in some ways more offended by the Warren Court's actions in the communist cases than in the civil rights cases. The Warren Court invalidated the criminal convictions of a lot of communists and a lot of people who were accused of affiliation with the Communist Party in one way or another on the basis that they had the right under the American Constitution to associate and to speak. And anyway, there's a lot of they're referred to as the red cases sometimes. And Eisenhower was more viscerally offended by those. I think he understood that civil rights was a much more complicated topic. In the case of the red cases, he just believed the court should just, at one point, Warren even asked him, what should we have done with these defendants? He said, I would have taken them outside and shot them. Now, that's Eisenhower in a bad mood, I suspect. I don't think he really would have done that. But his unhappiness with Warren was not confined to civil rights. That's my point.
We all have those bad days.
We all have those bad days. Most of us, are not as well remembered because we're fortunate as non-presidents not to have somebody write them down. But
absolutely. And so Jenna Ripke then asking about takeaways for us today, really, from the Eisenhower administration.
I think what I take away from Eisenhower in that period as the most germane to today is a style of leadership that does not demand to be front and center all the time, that is focused on results and long-term commitments, that relies on basic American values of decency and service and a lifelong commitment to his country, a willingness not to pursue selfish ends, but to genuinely try to act in the national interest. I think we would all be well served, Democrats and Republicans, by a commitment to those values.
I think that's a perfect note to wrap up on. So thank you so much, Jim, for your time with us today. And I really hope it works to bring you to Nebraska and Ashland next year. It would be great to all be together in person. There's so much to talk about. There's so many topics we didn't even get to, but that's the 50s for you. And so I encourage people to read Jim's book on Eisenhower. And Jim had, again, a brand new book on Jerry Brown. So that sounds like another really interesting one to check out as well. I just thank you for your time and for talking about all these issues with us. Hopefully next year is a different story as far as the state we're in. So, and I just also want to thank Christy Hyatt-Carley for helping manage this program, and Sherilyn Hansen, our communications manager, was watching things on Facebook for us today. And thank you again to everyone who supports Humanities Nebraska. Again, Ashland, early August 2021 will be the 50s in Focus Chautauqua. We'll have more announcements on that. In the meantime, there's going to be a lot of other things happening. I really want to draw everyone's attention, make sure you know about Doris Kearns Goodwin coming for the governor's lecture in the Humanities on September 22nd at the Lead Center with health guidelines willing. It's going to be taking place in person, but either way, it will also be available by live streaming. So talking about her book, Leadership in Turbulent Times. And just if you stay in touch with us by our social media and on our website and our emails and things like that, we'll keep you posted on lots of different programs. We just, again, hope you all stay well and appreciate being connected together as we explore different elements of our history. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening. And thank you, Jim.
Thank you.